All right, so in this lecture, we are going to add React Query to our base app, and then we are going to run useQuery to get some data from the server. Let's take a look at this scaffolding code that I have for this Blogum Ipsum app. I'm going to use VS Code to look at and edit code in this course, but you, of course, are welcome to use whichever code editor you prefer. So here are the files for our project. This project was created using Create React App. Here are the files of interest. They are in our source directory. So we have app.jsx, where we are displaying a title, Blogum Ipsum, and then our posts component. I'll hold down Command and click on the post component, and it will open the post component for me. So you can see our posts component is a little bit more complicated. We have a fetch posts function, and we're going to be using this to fetch our posts from JSON placeholder when we use useQuery. And the thing we're most interested in for our useQuery, for our posts data, is this place where we map our post data. And this data right now is an empty array, but we're going to replace that with useQuery. We map this data to list items and that are displaying the post title. We'll look at this on click in a moment. And there's clearly more to this posts component, such as this state and these buttons and so forth, but we'll get to those as we implement that functionality. So let's go back to our app, and this is where we are going to create our query client for React Query, and we're going to add the query provider that is going to make that client available to all the children. So let's import what we need from React Query. We need the query client and the query provider. And now we are going to create a query client. Now that we have the client, we can add the provider. And the provider is going to take this client as a prop. And the client contains the cache and all of our default options. So that will be available to the children of the provider. So that's the query client we just created. Close this down here. Okay, so now everything within this can use our React Query hooks. And specifically, we want to use our React Query hooks in this post component. So in the post component, I'm going to import useQuery. And useQuery is the hook that we're going to use when we want to fetch data from the server. So now we can go down here and replace this with useQuery. Our data will no longer be this hard-coded array. Instead, we are going to destructure the data property from the return object to useQuery. useQuery returns an object with a lot of properties. We will be looking at those properties in future lectures, but for now we're just going to destructure the data. Now useQuery takes some arguments. The first one is the query key, which is basically what are we going to name this query? This query I'm going to name posts. And then it takes the query function. How are we going to get the data for this query? For that, I'm going to use this fetch posts function. This needs to be an asynchronous function that fetches the data, which is what we have right here, conveniently. So now the data that we are mapping against is going to be whatever is returned from fetch posts, which is the JSON that's returned from this HTTP request. And we can take a quick peek at the shape of that data. So we can see it's an array of blog posts that have several properties: a user ID, an ID, a title, and a body. So for each item in that array, we are going to create a list item, and we're going to display the title of the post. All right, let's start it up and take a look. And this isn't looking so great. It's telling us it cannot read property map of undefined, which means that this data here is undefined. And so when we try and map it, it's like, man, map is only for arrays, and data right now is undefined. That's because fetch posts is asynchronous. And until fetch posts resolves, this data is going to be undefined from useQuery. useQuery doesn't know what to assign to the data when fetch posts hasn't come back yet with the data. We're going to deal with this more elegantly in the future, but for now we're just going to say if data is falsy, which undefined is, we're going to just do an early return. We're going to return a div. How will this fix things? Well, until fetch post resolves, data will be falsy. But when fetch post resolves, data will now contain an array. The component will re-render, and now it will be able to map. This will no longer do an early return when data contains an array, and now we will actually map the data. So let's see how that looks. And now we have our blog posts. We can even click on one of the titles and we'll get the details. This is the compelling text of that blog post. We're not getting the comments yet because we haven't yet implemented that. All right, join me in the next lecture where we will look at loading and error states from useQuery so that we can deal with that situation before we have data in a more elegant way.